What is up? This is Kira and I'll be talking about general advice on how to cut parts and also showing you what the workflow for cutting parts is like. Let's go. A little about me, I have been doing Live2D rigging since 2020, and I work with Emnich's model with Sashichi's art and rigged models illustrated by other artists such as Hyananatsu, Kamotsuru, and Wedi. This video is a collaboration with Clip Studio Paint, and I'll be teaching you guys the basics of illustrating a VTuber model. Since this is a collaboration with Clip Studio, I'll be teaching you how you can utilize Clip Studio Paint's tools for cutting. I'll also make the model PSD featured in this video available as a pay-to-use resource. My Clip Studio workspace and Toolbox profile for Clip Studio Paint are available for free in the description. I've also created playlists compiling videos that can help you more in terms of cutting specific parts of a model. The main software I use for anything VTuber model related are Clip Studio Paint and Photoshop. I use Clip Studio Paint for illustrating the models themselves as well as doing the cutting during the process. I use Photoshop for checking PSDs, especially if the file tree goes too deep or when I am just going to do the rigging. The Live2D manual says that Cubism, the rigging software, works best with PSDs exported from Clip Studio and Photoshop. So it's a pretty good idea to stick to those software. Some programs may cause problems down the line. Take Procreate for example. Its PSD export has unexpected sizes of each layer, and it will cause some problems in the illustration quality and texture atlas creation during the rigging phase. Don't make your rigger cry! You can use another software on your computer to re-export the model as a PSD and the problem should be solved. For this video, I will be focusing on CSP since that is the main program that I use for illustration. But don't worry, all of the tips I'll be sharing are still applicable for other programs, but some keyboard shortcuts and maybe special tools may vary for other software. Like they can be called differently or they could look a little different. But yeah, now on to the tools that I'll be using a lot when illustrating and cutting the VTuber model. Of course, I use the symmetry tool. It is a very important tool to use when you are illustrating a VTuber model. Asymmetry is alright, but you wouldn't want to introduce a lot of it, especially on the face. So a tip for the symmetry tool in Clip Studio, I didn't discover this until much later, but did you know that you can duplicate an already created ruler by just holding down Alt and dragging it to the layer of your choice? The more you know! Also, if you would like to center your symmetry ruler, you just select this tool, this operation tool, and click on your ruler and change the center X value. This should be the half value of what your canvas width is. You can also save some time from duplicating rulers by creating a single ruler in a separate layer, right-clicking the ruler, and check show in all layers. When you want to have symmetry when you are drawing, you can just enable that, and if you want to get rid of it, you can just disable it. Also, if you are experiencing problems with your brush such that it's not drawing symmetrically, you can just go to your tool settings, head on over to correction, and make sure that enable snapping is enabled. Now you can draw symmetrically. Yay. You could also apply rulers to folders just in case you're a little, lazy when it comes to duplicating all of those rulers. Speaking of folders, please use this for better organization because VTuber models could go up to 100 layers or even more. Next, the 3D model included in CSP. I swear to God, this tool is so useful, especially when I am starting to draw the model. I didn't know that knees were located that low. Lastly, I use various selection tools like lasso tool and quick mask tool to help with cutting, but I personally use the quick mask tool way more. I'll be discussing more tips about these tools in the next section of the video. Let us move on to the general workflow of cutting and illustration. So illustrators have different workflows for cutting. If it is your first couple of times illustrating and cutting a VTuber model, don't worry about establishing a solid workflow yet. Feel free to try different workflows and see what you like best and which workflow you're most comfortable with. Here are some workflows that I have seen VTuber model illustrators use. Some illustrators draw everything first and then cut. Some illustrators also, sketch and then draw parts according to how they'd like to be cut, like they'll draw the parts already separate. And lastly, it could be a mix of the two, which is my own workflow. The first thing I usually do is to try and think of what I want the VTuber to be. This time around, I wanted it to be food themed, and I thought of the food that I like the most, which is rice. But just a rice VTuber might be boring, so I went with onigiri, and thus she is called Onigirly. Ha 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 ha. Thank you to my viewer who suggested that name. Once I got the concept of the VTuber down, I'll create a new canvas and whip out the 3D model and get on to sketching. I highly recommend using a canvas with a width of 3000 to 4500 pixels. The height just needs to be adjusted depending on how tall the model is. With regards to DPI, it doesn't really matter if you are going to use the model just for digital purposes, but just to be safe, use a DPI between 150 and 300, just in case you'd want to print your VTuber model in the future. Next up, I would also open a new window view so I can see what the model looks like as a whole, but yeah, I forgot to do it. I got into working the VTuber model. When you want to have a good view of your model by using a new window, just go to Window, Canvas, and then click on New Window and drag this over to the side till you see a red line, and yeah, there you go. Once I am done with this sketch, I set it as a draft layer. You can set a layer as a draft layer by clicking this button. I set this as a draft layer so it doesn't interfere when I use the fill tool during the coloring stage. I do this because I like keeping the sketch visible. My sketches generally look better than the final product, so yeah, I'd like to see it. And of course, the next thing I do is line art. Believe it or not, it's actually my favorite process when illustrating. I am a certified masochist. When I make the line art, I try to draw parts in big batches. Like I draw them in separate layers, big cuts. I draw the face, eyes, hair, neck, torso, arms, and legs separate at the start. There is no need to completely draw the line art yet, as you can see in this model illustration, because this can be done later. This just helps in making the model look nice while working. Like you wouldn't want your model to look like it's being swarmed by bees or something like that. There is also no need to follow how I draw parts, and this is still up to you. There are some parts where drawing them together feels more comfortable, and other times it feels better when they're separate. Next step is coloring and shading. A very useful tool for coloring is the enclose and fill tool. This just makes it so easy to fill in base colors. Clip Studio has a tool like this by default, and there are also similar tools that you can find on Clip Studio assets, and I'll link the tool that I have down below. I also make sure that I have a sub view open for the sketch that I did, and this just makes it easy to pick colors off of this sketch or another reference. Please note that Live2D only supports the normal, multiply, and additive or add glow layer blending modes. So yeah, don't go too wild with the blending modes that's available to you. For this step, I like to keep the base color and the shading layers separate at the start, just in case some shading layers can be counted as separate parts. Take the eye shading, for example. In the beginning, I colored this separately so I wouldn't have a difficult time doing the separation. There are also some parts which I think should be separate no matter what, and it's usually things like highlights, hard shadows, gradients, and textures. After I am done coloring and shading, I merge the shading layers for parts that I feel like they should be merged. I usually do this for clothing and limbs, and anything that doesn't need very detailed rigging or parts where more details don't really need to be shown when it's turning. If you are already working with a rigger, it's a good idea to ask them about their preferences for part separation. You could also always purchase the model PSD used in this video for reference. I just feel like it might be a good reference since I am a rigger and this is how I'd want the parts to be separate. The next step in the process is more precise cutting. You should utilize the lasso tool and quick mask tool for this, but I personally use the quick mask tool a lot. As you can see in this time lapse, it's a red color that you see when I'm making selections. Yeah, basically the quick mask tool lets you make textured selections or even gradient selections. So when you want a selection to have the same texture as certain brushes, you can do that with the quick mask tool. So yeah, I love it. And also makes it easier to visualize the selection compared to the lasso tool. And when I am making precise cuts, I usually select the part I want to cut using the quick mask tool and copy and paste it. After that, I do some cleaning. Copying and pasting instead of cutting pasting might also make it easier for you to do void filling for parts that need some kind of continuity. I'll be giving more tips about filling in void areas in the next section of the video. The next quote-unquote step I'm going to discuss is done throughout the process of illustrating the model. Organizing just helps make working easier because VTuber models have a ton of layers, depending on the complexity. Make sure to use folders and name them appropriately as well, and it is also going to be very nice if you could create separate folders for right and left parts of a certain body part, you know, like eyes. You could use as many folders as you like, so don't be shy, bro. Keep on pressing the folder button. I generally have this kind of folder structure in my models. You can just pause or play the video slowly if you want to review it, so I'll just be showing it on screen, scrolling it at a decent pace so you can look at what the folders are. Yeah. I also use a custom keyboard shortcut to select layers and put the said layers in one folder. I think I set this shortcut as Ctrl-G or something. So yeah, if you want to use the same shortcuts as I do, my workspace is available in the description. And if you use my workspace, you can also use the same palette layouts, shortcut settings. Yeah, I just mentioned that. Command bar layouts and preferences for unit settings. And lastly, you should use underscores instead of spaces when you are naming your layers. I just make it a habit to do this so I could avoid using plugins. So yeah, make sure to name your layers properly and add labels like R and L at the end of each name, if they are, you know, right and left parts of a certain body part. If some parts can't be helped but be named the same, feel free to use numbers, just like what I did with the hair. There is just a ton of strands and I can't really think of unique names for them, bro. I don't really follow this rule strictly during the coloring and shading phase, especially if I know that I'll be merging the shading layers at the end. I follow this rule strictly only when I am doing the cutting. Now let us move on to ensuring quality and dealing with void spaces. It is going to be immensely helpful if a VTuber illustrator knows how to operate Live2D and how it generally makes something move. You can also go to Live2D's website and download some models and play around with them in the software. There is a free version that you can use without activating the trial. If you want to know a little more, like if you're not familiar with Live2D, here is a quick overview of how a rigger does discuss their work on VTuber models. A rigger rotates and deforms parts that you have drawn to simulate a 3D feel. It's kind of similar to rotation using the transform tool, and for deformation, it is quite similar to liquefying and using mesh transform. These are the same tools that you can use in Clip Studio Paint, so you can check for void space as well. Thank you so much to Yankos for sharing us this helpful tip. I didn't really utilize this a lot because I use Live2D for, checking for void spaces. You can use the transform tool to rotate things like limbs. Be sure to change the pivot point so you can properly simulate the rotation. If you see any gaps in the art, feel free to draw more of that part. For the mesh transformation tool, you can use this on parts like hair and torso parts, and any other parts where you'd like to check. You can try and simulate hair swaying and perspective changes of body parts so you can see if the layers behind them need more filling. I advise duplicating the parts first though, so you can go back to the original form without pressing Ctrl-Z so many times. If you find that the mesh transformation tool is a bit hard to use, you can use the liquefy tool instead. I personally like Clip Studio Paint's liquefy tool more compared to Photoshop's because it displays the output real time and there are no pop-up windows involved. Another thing that I like to do when I am doing void filling checking thing is to lower the opacity of two connected parts like limbs, just to make sure that there is enough overlap between them. Yeah, but other than that, I always try to make sure that I draw enough of the part so the rigger could, just rig freely. Another thing that you can do to ensure the quality of your VTuber illustration is checking for holes. I recommend using an offensive color like very bright green as a background and see if there are any holes in the art. I tend to use white and black, like I have a layer of white and another layer of black, and I change the opacities to make it more darker, more gray, that thing. Instead of holes, you might sometimes find pixel dirt and it can be difficult to select them. For this issue, I use the multiple layers eraser subtool to get rid of any dirt. Lastly, please make sure that when you do your cutting, you do it neatly, like the silhouettes of the parts aren't, very messy. They should have a nice shape. When the rigger imports a PSD in Live2D, they might have a difficult time doing the mesh, like they might have to go over each layer manually and try to mesh it nicely. For the next section of the video, I will be discussing what you should expect when you are working with riggers. Riggers have different preferences for model art, and you have to accept that your cutting won't always be perfect for every Live2D modeler. There is a chance that the separation is too little or too much, but honestly, in my opinion, the latter is more preferable. If you like, you can include separation of line art in certain parts like the face. You can also be requested to separate the base color, shading, and line art for some parts, especially when the rigger makes high range models or does 3D-ish effects. I recommend keeping revisions in mind when you are pricing your work and including this in the base price. But yeah, expect that you might be asked to revise, especially if you're doing VTuber illustration for not a very long time. I'd also like to add that some riggers request separation from the artist because they may want to keep the integrity of the art. Another reason could be that riggers, based on their terms of service, they are not hired to do any cutting. I personally include some cutting in my pricing, especially if the cutting needed is very easy to do and doesn't change the art a lot. Second to the last section of this video are just things to keep in mind and general advice. So here are some things that I'd like you to remember when making a model. First, when in doubt, separate. As I have mentioned, an excess of parts is generally better than a lack of them. Riggers can choose to merge certain parts once they have received the file. Second, I think I mentioned this earlier, is to cut neatly, don't leave erasure marks, and make sure that the silhouette of parts are neat as well. Third, Try to think in 3D and don't be afraid to use 3D model assets as reference when you are illustrating. Try to imagine the model moving as if it was 3D and ask yourself the following questions. Would there be awkward void spaces if a certain part moves out of the way? And should a part move separate from other parts? Will having these parts separate give a nicer sense of depth when the model is rigged? Yeah, something like that. Fourth, you can always look for resources for model cutting. I really recommend looking at Live2D sample models for starters. There are also Live2D illustrators that sell example models on places like Gumroad or Ko-Fi, and they also post on Twitter. And fifth, don't be afraid to ask questions from fellow model artists. I'm pretty sure that there are a ton of people in the Live2D community who are willing to answer your questions. And that concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I was able to teach you something and introduce you to VTuber illustration in a nice way. Yeah, and I also hope that I have compiled enough resources you need to butcher a VTuber well. You can find the resources I've compiled in the video description, and I would also like to thank Clip Studio Paint for sponsoring this video. It is literally a dream come true to collaborate with them. I guess I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya! Kira!